Good morning, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, number 134. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. My name is Lorna McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. This series is brought to you, as you'll know by now, by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are grateful for that, as I always say. As I mentioned, my name is Lorna McGinn. I'm a Community Engagement Officer at the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland in Inverness, Fort William, Portree and Wick. And I know if anyone is watching in Caithness, you maybe have been up in Nucleus yesterday because they had a big open event, and I know lots and lots of people attended and were really enjoyed it, so that's lovely. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, continuing our theme of in living memory and looking this week at the McLean family of Raasay. I wanted to put this episode in this point in the sequence of Learn with Lorna because I am talking not only about a family who are absolutely well remembered and well loved by a lot of people, and of course some of the family are of course still around, and I'm seeing Anne, you're watching in Raasay, so I hope that you can maybe share if you have any memories of the family. But also this is a family for whom education was really important, as you'll see, and a family that produced numerous teachers, and so it's quite nice to have this following on from Teachers Week. One of those I'm going to speak about is surely one of Scotland's most famous school teachers, Sorley Maclean. I'm focusing on the 7 children born to Malcolm or Callum Ian, who was a tailor, and his wife Christina née Nicholson. The family were settled in Oskeg in Raasay between the children were born between 1909 and 1926. Quite extraordinary, as I came to sort of write that down, to go 17 years of childbearing. Not uncommon at all at the time, but still quite considerable. I will only be giving a brief overview of this family, and as I start to go through, you'll see quite how extraordinary each of their stories is and how difficult it would be to tell more of it than I'm able to in this space. But at the end, I'll come back to places that you can go to find out more. So, talking about the children of Malcolm McLean and Christina Nicholson. Malcolm's family was from Raasay, having come before that from North Uist. Excuse me. And Christina's was she was one of the Nicholsons from Skye. Both Malcolm and Christina's families had within them noted scholars, noted poets, and tradition bearers, also known as Shonachie, people who would hand down the stories of a family or a place through generations and generations, traditional stories. And both sides of this family contained tradition bearers. Also, as it branched back on Malcolm's side and Christina's side into the MacLeods, into the Mathesons, there were also noted tradition bearers. And this becomes very, very relevant. Now, these ancestors and family members over generations, both near and far, so people in the far past and people very close to this immediate family I'm talking about, that genealogy was to be really important for Malcolm and Christina's children. Perhaps particularly Malcolm's mother, Mary Matheson, who lived with the family for many years and had a very, very influential role in the children's lives, in their young lives. Using records held at our Skye and Lochalis Archive Centre in Portree, we can find references to those earlier generations of this family, so much kind of intertwined and part of the Skye, Raasay, Hebridean landscape. So for instance, if we look at census records, we can see Samuel Nicholson, Christina's father, at the Croft in Portree, and using the Raasay estate rentals that we hold, we can see Malcolm's grandfather, John McLean, at Ballyhoon in 1854. So it's clearly a family with a long and deep connection to the land, to that part of the world, and to the people who had struggled on that land through generations. These 7 children were brought up with traditional story, verse and song, surrounded and immersed in it. Stories of people and songs and poems of people like Mary Vore, who I've done a previous Learn with Lorna on, and others, as well as obviously, of course, being from Raasay, a naturally strong Gaelic focus, both language and culture, and also a very religious one as well. So Malcolm and Christina's 7 children, who I'm going to talk about, were John, born in 1909, Samuel or Sorley in 1911, Callum Ian, born in 1915, Alistair, born in 1918, Norman in 21, Ishbel in 1924, and Mary Margaret, born in 1926. And as I said, 17 years of having children. All of those 7 children went on to make a substantial contribution to the culture and society of Skye, of Raasay, of the west coast of Scotland, and had the roles which allowed them to have a huge influence over literally thousands of people's lives. I'm going to go through them in order, except Sorley, who I'll come back to at the end, because he is undoubtedly the most famous of the family. So let's start with John. John was born on the 11th of November 1909, Malcolm and Christina's eldest child, and of course eldest son as well. And with all the McLean children, they went, as John did, to Raasay Public School before moving on up to Portree Secondary School, where pupils had to, and still have to in many cases, have to stay in the hostel through the week, returning at weekends and holidays. From 1933 onwards, that hostel was the building in which Skyline Archive Centre is now situated, in the Elgin Hostel. After school, John went on to Edinburgh University, where he graduated with a first-class MA Honours in Classics. And much like the Tommy McPherson family story I told a couple of weeks ago, we're looking here at an extraordinarily high-achieving family. Every one of the children contributed something outstanding. After winning prizes for his work in Greek, John gained a scholarship after Edinburgh University to go on and study at Cambridge, and he also studied for a time in Vienna, studying Celtic philology. He went into the teaching of classics, spending many years in schools, including the Royal High School in Edinburgh, Inverness Royal Academy, and also being HM Inspector for Schools and Rector of Oban High School. And so therefore we can find him referenced in the school records that we hold. That passion for Gaelic language and culture that was strong in the whole family was, of course, also strong in John. And he was, according to his siblings, a very fine singer. He was a composer of Gaelic poetry and a very talented piper, both playing and writing music for the pipes. And amongst all these other skills, if this wasn't enough, John dedicated himself to translating the Greek classics into Gaelic, so for instance Homer's Odyssey and other pieces of work. And he also supported the extraordinary work done by his brother Callum, who I'm going to be talking about next. John married twice, Morag MacLeod, who died young from TB, and then Catherine Mary Nicholson, before passing away in 1970, having left a great legacy. If we pass over Sorley, the second son, for a moment, I'll come on to the third sibling, Callum Ian McLean, another one who left an extraordinary legacy, and I will use the word extraordinary several times throughout this episode, I'm afraid. I will try not to. But you'll see as I tell you Callum's story from an archive point of view why he's such a kind of towering figure. Callum was born in September 1915 and went, like his siblings, to Raasay Public School and then Portree Secondary. In the register of students who are resident in the Elgin Hostel, so that's obviously the Skyline building, where we hold that record, which is nice, Callum McLean appears in that list of students staying in that building. His parent or guardian listed as Callum McLean, Churchton, Raasay. And just to deviate slightly from Callum's story quickly, At Skye and Lochalsh we hold a collection of photographs of that family home, and of course there are references to it in the valuation rolls as well that detail property ownership. In addition to that, that particular house at Churchton was one of those sold by William Baird and Co., the iron ore extracting company, who were based on Raasay, or had a base on Raasay. So we can we can see in those documents the sale from William Baird and Co. to Malcolm McLean, which tells us that the land was given in consideration of £300 paid by Malcolm. But to go back to Callum's story, I think the best way for me to tell you about the outstanding contribution that Callum made to Scottish history is to read his biography from Tober and Dulcas, the Kist of Riches website, and you'll see what I mean. This is a slightly long reading, but it's an extraordinary story, so I need to tell you all of it. One of the pioneering field workers of the School of Scottish Studies, there can be few others who parallel Callum Ian McLean in terms of his contribution to the field of Scottish studies and to the preservation of a culture and a way of life which has changed dramatically in the 70 years since he began recording the stories, songs and traditions of the Highlands on New Year's Day 1951. In his 9 years collecting on behalf of the School of Scotland, the school in Scotland, McLean carried out hundreds of recordings, said to amount to around 100 miles of tape. Particularly aware of the situation on the ground, McLean constantly stressed that more field work was necessary and that he would make it his life's work to record the folklore and way of life in the Highlands. Born in Raasay on the 6th of September 1915, Callum Ian was the third son of the tailor Malcolm McLean and Christina Nicholson. Callum Ian was not alone in his scholarly achievements. His younger brother, Sorley, went on to become one of the most prominent Gaelic poets and scholars, and among other siblings were 2 doctors and 2 teachers. McLean started his schooling in Raasay and then progressed to Portree Secondary School. He then went on to read Celtic languages at the University of Edinburgh, graduating with a first-class honours in 1939. Following his graduation, he secured scholarships to study Irish in Ireland, but following the outbreak of the Second World War, these came to an abrupt end. McLean remained in Ireland during the war, where he spent a large part of his time in Connemara, collecting folklore on a part-time basis for the Irish Folklore Commission. In 1945 he secured a permanent role at the Irish Folklore Commission, and in 1946 was sent to Scotland to collect material in Scottish Gaelic, due to the absence of a folklore commission in Scotland. He was to spend the next 5 years working for the commission in Scotland before transferring to the newly established School of Scottish Studies in 1951. His warm and open personality were often said to be a key factor in his success when carrying out field work. And it says here that Sean O'Sullivan said about him in 1975, "Above all else, his personal qualities stood him in good stead, and opened all doors and hearts to him in his homeland as they had in Ireland. He had kindness, generosity, open-heartedness, candour and firmness of opinion. He was good-humoured and light of heart. He was unselfishly devoted to task. He loved country people best of all, perhaps, and his ability to sing or lilt or play music or tell stories ensured that he was quickly accepted into the company of strangers." Callum Ian's career came to a premature end following his untimely death in South Uist at the age of 44 in August 1960. His legacy, however, lives on, and his recordings continue to provide a remarkable insight into Gaelic culture and a way of life which has all but disappeared over the intervening years. From stories about the Sheelings to tales of the Fianna, his recordings are rich and varied and recorded from people of all walks of life. The Tober and Dulcas website is a treasure trove of Callum Ian's work. He features in almost 4,000 recordings, with a quarter of those coming from South Uist. The remainder of his tracks were recorded across the Highlands and Islands, in the Borders and in Shetland. So you can see, as I said, from an archival point of view, why he is, as I say, a towering figure. It's thought that his collection of 4,000 oral history recordings make up one of the most important and extensive collections of oral history recordings in Western Europe. So as if all John's achievements of writing and playing and studying the classics and translating into Gaelic, Homer and so on, wasn't enough, we now have Callum contributing that huge wealth of material to the generations of the future. I mentioned that John had supported Callum in that work. Now, John contributed songs and piping tunes to that collection. And when Callum died, very young at the age of 44, and he succumbed to a cancer that meant he had to have his arm removed, during which he carried on recording interviews, and then sadly passed away very young. When he died, his older brother John wrote a lament about his death, which also appears on Tober and Dulcus, and Sorley also would write an elegy. I would encourage you to go on to Tober and Dulcus. I'll post a link at the end of this. Have a listen to some of those recordings, but also I would really encourage you, if you can, to go and have a look at a picture of Callum. If you type in something like Callum Ian McLean folklorist, he'll come up. He has the most beautiful face, a face full of fun, and you can absolutely look at him and say you can see why people opened up to him and told him their stories. So we've come through John and then Callum, and the next son was Alistair, who was born in 1918. After leaving Portree High School, going through that same local education, Alistair went on to St Andrews University after being again awarded a scholarship to study, this time to study medicine. As with all of the other siblings, and of course that entire generation, the war played a very substantial role in John's life, and he served with the Royal Army Medical Corps in Burma and in India before returning to Scotland. He served as a doctor in various locations across Scotland before settling to work in South Uist for 32 years with his wife, Rena McCaskill. And again, as you'll be expecting by now, the importance of Gaelic language, Gaelic culture was central to Alistair's life. And in addition to his medical work and those 32 years as a GP in South Uist, he wrote and researched and edited and contributed to books and papers and research projects about Scottish history, and in particular about island history. And he contributed over 180 recordings to that School of Scottish Studies archive I mentioned. Alistair passed away in 1999, but having again left a legacy not only of that research and writing and recording, but also of the many people whose lives he would have changed and altered by his work as a doctor. The youngest of the McLean brothers was Norman, who progressed from Raasay to Portree and then on to Edinburgh University. Training, like his brother Alistair, to be a doctor, he practised in various places, including, I believe, in Wakefield in Yorkshire, and he married Ailsa Rednall in 1951. And in 1962, Norman joined the Territorial Army, with whom he continued to serve and work alongside until his death. And his influence in the Territorial Army was such that he became advisor to the General of the Northern District on all matters territorial, and also he was awarded an OBE for his service to the Territorial Army. Again, that whole generation impacted by the aftermath of World War I, and then coming just into their 20s and 30s and late teen years as World War II is breaking out. And you may remember I mentioned that in Tommy McPherson's episode, that he said, we were brought up entirely surrounded by the information of what had happened in World War I and what our expectations would be when World War II broke out. And I think that's very hard for us to imagine living under that pressure. Norman, as well as being a doctor, was a piper and a well-known piper. And it's clear again that that influence of traditional culture and music was absolutely imbued by the entire family. Norman McLean died in 1998. I'm coming now onto the two sisters before rounding off with a brief overview of Sorley's life and work. The oldest of the two daughters was Ishbel, who was born in 1924. She followed her brothers through Raasay and Portree schools before she too went on to further education. She went on to train as a teacher in Murray House in Edinburgh. So you can see we've already had several teachers and several doctors. Again though, World War II cast that shadow over this life. When World War II broke out, Ishbel was called up to support the war effort and she went into nursing. And it's a pull away, I think, from that cultural and educational strand that's so central to the family, but then a pull towards that caring and medical role that also seems to have been very important. Ishbel worked in the Victoria Infirmary in Glasgow for a few years before returning after the war to complete her teacher training and going on to teach domestic science. She married John McLean from her home community of Oscaig in Raasay in 1950, and she went on to live in Crieff before retiring to Perth. Mary Margaret, the youngest child, was born in 1926, and she followed a similar path to so many of her siblings. She went again from Raasay to Portree and then on again to teacher training, but this time she went to Jordan Hill College in Glasgow. Absolutely fascinating how of these 7 children, all of them ended up in either education or medicine, even though their parents weren't in those roles. As I said at the beginning, every single one of these children, or adults by the time they did it, contributed something really remarkable to society, and also every single one of them carried music, song, story, history, and that kind of spirit of Raasay and the land that they had been really immersed in. They all carried that with them wherever they went. Mary's teaching career took her from Staffin to Auchterarder, Raasay to Renfrewshire and to Edinburgh before she retired to Portree. Now in Skyloch Archive Centre we hold a collection that was gathered as part of an exhibition that was held in 2007 to mark the achievements of these 7 siblings. And included in this collection are some interviews recorded by Iona MacDonald with Ishbel and Mary, who by the time this exhibition was held were the only 2 surviving siblings. And they include some great stories of family and friends. So for instance, Mary says, "I don't know where she did it." She's talking about her auntie, but when she came home in the summertime there was always great parties. Our Uncle Angus, our mother's brother, was a very good singer, and he would come, and our Uncle Alec, you know, the one who wrote the history of Skye, he'd be there, and you know, they'd all be interested in the songs, and she remembered all the songs, and she was quite a good singer, and Auntie Flora was a good singer too. And someone says, "Are these aunties on the Nicholson side?" And the interviewer says, and they say, no, this was the McLean side. Auntie Peggy was our father's sister, and Auntie Flora was another sister. On our mother's side, Angus was a very good singer, and so was Auntie Katie, and they loved the old songs. And Auntie Peggy wouldn't be happy at all at hearing some of the people singing the songs later on if they weren't singing them properly, you see. Oh yes, that was awfully important. Yes, it was important to them that tradition would be kept intact. And then they go on to say, but Sorley couldn't sing at all. He was always singing Scorrie Breck, you know. He was always singing that, very keen on it. He would give it great licks, but he couldn't sing. He had a terrible voice. And our mother couldn't sing either. No, she couldn't sing. Our father was a good singer, but she couldn't sing. And Sorley seemed to take after her because everyone else in the family could keep to the tune, but he couldn't. But his rhythm was good, and he would teach us songs, and then we would pick them up. It must have been a great sorrow to Sorley that he couldn't sing. I'm sure it must have been, to have so many words in his head and not be able to express them. And they go on to say, but Johnny, the oldest brother, Johnny was a good singer, and he played the pipes very well. And Callum was a good singer. He sang a lot. He could keep a tune. And Norman was musical because he played the pipes. And Alistair was very fond of songs. He could sing all right. And you just, you get, when you're reading the whole transcript, you get a feeling of these 2 sisters having a laugh and remembering and thinking of all these brothers who had gone before them. But also, one after the other referenced there, you know, well, he could play the pipes and he could sing and he could write and he could, and we would all get together and we would all sing, and it really conjures up an image of the family, I think. Now that exhibition told the story of all the siblings, but Sorley, the second son, is by far the most famous, and so I'm going to finish with a look at his story, pulled from various sources and various collections, but particularly from sorleymaclean.org, which I would really encourage you to look at if you're interested in this story, and I'll give all these details again at the end. Sorley McLean, Samuel, or Sorley, was born on the 26th of October 1911. We have in our school logbooks for Portree an entry on the 10th of June 1926 that records his successful place in the Edinburgh bursary competition. We also, of course, have records of him in the admission registers for Raasay. Sorley was a lover from a young age of poetry and literature, and was completely immersed again in that the culture and the history and the people and the events of the Highlands, and particularly the islands. People like Mary Vore were a huge influence on Sorley, as well as his parents, those aunts and uncles that the sisters talked about, and his grandparents. So between this cultural immersion within the family, the long remembered stories of difficulty on the land and oppression and problems, that was one influence, but that collided with his love of Shakespeare, of Virgil, of Horace, of Donne, Eliot, Blake, all sorts of writers. So you can imagine what a kind of fertile breeding ground his mind was. From a young age, he felt the call of politics. He's talked about the influence of religion, but particularly about politics. He went on to become a socialist, a Labour supporter, and he had a very passionate hatred for the lasting, passionate hatred for fascism and what fascism had been and could become. He was also influenced a lot in his politics by the lasting ramifications of the clearances and the impact that this had had on the society and the world around him. His other huge passion from childhood right through his life was Shinty, and he's a great figure in Shinty's story too. Sorley went on to Edinburgh University, where he graduated with a first-class honours in English before going on to Murray House to do teacher training. While he was at Murray House, incidentally, he met Hugh MacDiarmid, who's another very famous Scottish writer and poet. While he was at university, immediately upon entering university, and subsequently, he questioned whether he should have followed his heart and done Celtic studies or Gaelic, but he had felt at the time that there would be no work if he did this, and that was why he pursued English. Throughout the 1930s, Sorley continued to do what he had started much earlier, writing poetry. And it was around this time in the 1930s that he destroyed almost all of the poetry he had written in English. He said that he preferred to write in his native Gaelic for two reasons, particularly because he felt he could express himself better in Gaelic and that his poems came from the heart in his natural language. But also he said that he felt for reasons of patriotic loyalty that he should write in Gaelic, because the decline of Gaelic was something which weighed on him and worried him throughout his life, as I'll come back to. In addition to continuing with this writing, Sorley went on to teach. He taught English in Portree secondary school, spending some time resident in the Elgin Hostel, that Skyloch Alsh building, to supervise the pupils who were there, which he found a huge, huge pressure and very unconducive to being able to be creative. His career then took him to Mull, and he wrote about his time in Mull that he found it almost unbearably painful to be in a place where the effects of the clearances were still so much felt, and so the ramifications had been so serious that he felt it was almost too painful to be there. He then went to teach in Edinburgh, and also he spent some time in Hawick teaching evacuees when the war broke out, all the while writing poetry. Because the 1930s saw the advent of something Sorley had been in fear of, the rise of fascism, something which had been kind of eating away at him as a concern for many years. First of all, the Spanish Civil War happened, which he nearly went to fight in. He was keen to go and fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, but his mother was ill and he wasn't able to go. And then, of course, the outbreak of World War II, which kind of compounded everything he had been so concerned would come to pass. In 1940, Sorley joined the Signal Corps and went on to fight in Egypt as part of the Royal Horse Artillery. He was severely wounded 3 times in the Second World War, and it's really quite extraordinary that all these siblings came out the other side. But he was severely wounded 3 times, including at El Alamein, before he was invalided out of the army in 1943. It was also at that period, coming through the war years, that the first volume of Sorley Maclean's poetry was published. The late 1940s and early 1950s were spent teaching in Edinburgh at Boroughmuir, and also publishing poems and writings, including what is now probably his most famous poem, Hallig, which is about the clearances on Raasay. By now, he was accompanied by his wife, Raasay Cameron, who he'd married in Inverness in 1946, and their children, Ishbel, Katrina and Mary, who incidentally would all go on to become writers and singers and poets and artists before Katrina's very sad early death. However, during this time spent in Edinburgh, Sorley felt the pull of home, and in February 1956 he took up the position of headmaster of Plockton Secondary in Lochalsh, close to where his grandmother's family had lived generations before. And as well as teaching, and many people have fond memories of Sorley as their headmaster. If anyone does, please share them, because I've loved everyone I've heard so far. I heard a story yesterday of someone saying that one day someone hit a shinty ball through the window of the school, and Sorley just opened the window and went, "What an excellent shot." My colleague Grant, who, if you've ever been into the Archive Centre, you'll be familiar with Grant, my lovely colleague, had Sorley as his headmaster, and he told me a fantastic story about Sorley bursting into the room, shouting something, and his teeth coming out and flying across the room. Lots of people have fond memories of Sorley. So as well as all of this and all this ability to shape lives as a teacher, he continued to write, and he continued to advocate for the status of the Gaelic language. Have a listen to this note that my colleague Catherine in Skye Lochalsh sent me. During his time in Plockton, Sorley McLean worked tirelessly to improve the situation of the Gaelic language, the inexorable decline of which was a source of deep anxiety to him. He had observed its decline in Skye, and then most markedly in Mull, during the time he spent there in the late 1930s. The most detailed account of Sorley McLean's part in the campaign to achieve a higher leaving certificate examination paper specifically designed for Gaelic learners, called the Learner's Paper, is given in an essay by Angus MacNeill. In 1966, Sorley McLean gave a paper to the Gaelic Society of Inverness on problems in Gaelic education, in which he offered a serious analysis of the position of Gaelic in educational provision in Scotland. He drew comparisons with countries in mainland Europe where children learned 3 or 4 languages, including their own. He argued that children in Scotland could surely take up other languages besides English, adding, "Surely it's not expecting too much of patriotism to demand that Gaelic should be one of the 3 languages they learn." So you can really get a sense of that passion. Sorley retired from teaching in 1972, by now in his 60s. And what's extraordinary, and I've mentioned this in several episodes about different people, but what's extraordinary is it's at this point that he starts to come to greater prominence. So he's already become well known, well loved, seen as a huge transformative influence on Gaelic writing and poetry within that Gaelic speaking world. But it's at this point that he really goes beyond that. His writings about land, about struggles, equality and Gaeldom, and language and politics and love and world events, all of those things start to breach out with that Gaelic speaking world and into the wider world. Further publication of his poetry and prose writings in books and anthologies and periodicals and in journals all led for him for requests to him to go and speak, to travel, to give readings. And in his retirement, he spent time as a creative writer in residence at the University of Edinburgh and as the Feely for the Salmarostic Feely being the kind of like the resident poet, and Sal Morostig being the Gaelic Medium College, for which he was on the board of trustees. He was held in great esteem by other writers and poets, including the very famous Irish poet Seamus Heaney, Hugh MacDiarmid, and many, many others. And it was interesting to see that his ability to elevate Gaelic onto the world stage, drawing the eyes of the world onto the language and the culture of the Highlands and Islands. I read a quote sometime the other day of somebody saying, it's even more extraordinary when you consider his prominence when it's a language that is spoken by comparatively so few people in the world, yet the ability to convey the message and the passion and the stories behind it pulled people in who had no previous link to Gaeldom. Before his death in 1996 in Inverness, Sorley had been awarded 7 honorary degrees, 11 other honours including honorary fellowships and so on, and 5 awards including the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry. I want to share with you an extract from his profile on the Scottish Poetry Library website. When people talk about Gaelic poetry in the 20th century, particularly when that discussion is held in English, more often than not, what they're talking about is Sorley Maclean. More than any of his contemporaries, Maclean brought Gaelic poetry back into contact with currents of European art, politics and philosophy from which it had been excluded since the 17th century. More than half a century on, Sorley Maclean is widely considered to be the greatest Gaelic poet of the 20th century and occupies a space in the wider Scottish literary canon unequalled by any other Gaelic writer. Maclean's reputation rests upon 2 extended texts, the Dan de Eivir that made up the bulk of the 1943 volume, and the An Cuillin, the Cuillins, 1939, a long political poem which uses the famous mountain range on the Isle of Skye as the symbolic basis for a meditation on political commitment in Europe that was being torn apart by competing ideologies in the middle years of the 20th century. Both of these texts are highly complex, combining references to Gaelic song, poetry, music and history with the art and politics of the rest of Europe. The famous 17th century piper Patrick Moore MacCrimmon rubs shoulders with Beethoven, the 18th century Gaelic love poet William Ross with Alexander Bloch and Charles Baudelaire. In doing so, Maclean asserted the right of Gaelic artists and Gaelic speakers to participate in the mainstream of European culture, and by extension, he claimed his own poetry an importance that transcended linguistic boundaries. The appeal to the fate of Europe as a whole is new in Gaelic poetry, as is the connection between the oppression of people under fascism and the plight of the Gaels shipped off as slaves to the New World in the 17th century. But the poem itself exploits the abundance of rhyme in Gaelic to bring the poem to the resounding perfect cadence of its closing line. Gaelic verse is here deployed to a new purpose, re-energising itself in the process. It goes on to say that both of those named works have now been published in full annotated editions, and it will be interesting to see what effect these will have on younger Gaelic writers and on scholarly assessment of Maclean's work. Despite, or perhaps because of, the contradictions and the difficulty of Maclean's poetry, he remains the Gaelic poet who is most widely read, most frequently anthologised, and most often translated into other languages. His mastery of his chosen medium and his confident engagement with European politics and the whole of the European poetic tradition makes him one of the major Scottish poets of the modern era. Quite extraordinary. I'm going to stop there. I'm aware I've run over, but as you can see, they are a remarkable family who have left a huge legacy between the teachers and the doctors who have that personal one-to-one influence on people, to the writers, the musicians, the pipers, Callum with his 4,000 recordings of people. I want to finish by saying I have deliberately not read a poem. A, because, as you'll know, I'm not a Gaelic speaker, but also because I'd encourage you to find an extract of Sorley reading his own work. It's very easy to do. If you're interested in finding out more about this family Then there's the Callum McLean project, which is a website that will give you more information about Callum's life and work. Tober and Dulchas, which is a huge repository of oral history recordings, which again I'll post a link to. SorleyMaclean.org, which includes videos of Sorley speaking, and the Great Book of Skye, which gives some of the biographies of the family I've spoken about. So thank you very much for joining me. That's lovely, Mari, to see your message there that it was Ishbel was the one you knew. That's lovely, because I'm so pleased, because as I was writing it I thought I wish I could tell more about the stories of the girls and what these women went on to do, because as you know, I say teachers have such a position of responsibility and influence, so I'm delighted that you remember Ishbel. So thank you. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I'll be looking at further stories of migration. That one will be pre-recorded, and I know that makes it a bit trickier to find, but it will be pre-recorded as I'm going to speak to about 350 secondary school pupils. So I have to do that as well, I'm afraid. So I hope you can join me next week. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you.